Hey everyone, Jane back today with the next step on our Crochet Quilt Throw. Today I'll be sharing how to place your completed squares and how to assemble them using a simple whip stitch. These are techniques that you'll be able to use in any blanket that you make with these squares. This particular centerpiece has 64 squares, which is a lot of squares. So I have a few tips and tricks on how to keep yourself organized and help you take it one step at a time. In the last tutorial, I shared the two-tone version of the square, and on the blog post, you can find the chart of the exact colors for all 64 squares with a square number attached. I like to tag my squares when I have this many different ones, as it makes the assembly process so much more organized and much less stressful. I like to use metal ring tags and I attach them with either yarn or my stitch markers or paper clips, but you can use anything. You can use string tags, you can use stick-it notes, whatever makes sense to you, whatever you can find in your dollar store. There's lots of ways to number your squares. Here you can see the grid for the 64 squares, which are laid out as 8 squares by 8 squares. When I overlay it onto the finished image, you can see how the squares are to be laid out and oriented. With this geometric pattern, some squares are slanted to the left and some to the right, so it helps to see the finished piece to see how to orient squares. The full downloadable PDF pattern for this throw is available in my shop, and it has much more detailed color charts if you're looking for further help with the layout. But this image and the grid pretty much sums up the layout for you. In the last tutorial, I mentioned that when you fasten off the colors to leave them nice and long in order to sew the squares together. There'll be lots of ends to darn in on this one, so the less of those, the better. If you can find the room, lay out all your squares first as they are oriented in the design. This allows you to determine what direction you want the solid squares to be lying in with regards to how best to use that yarn end for sewing in. I like to attach my squares in rows and then I attach the rows together. This is just what makes the most sense for my brain. You may prefer to attach each square in order or by blocks or whatever makes the most sense to you. So here I have 3 of the squares laid out. I have a solid square and then I have 2 of the two-tone squares. I would lay them out according to my grid. So these aren't in any particular spot. They're just examples to use. So you can see here I have these nice long ends. And when you lay them out, they don't always work with using this end. In this particular layout, they do. This medium blue right here will work great to join these two together. And then this medium blue that's at the top, I'll leave that when I want to join the rows together. It might work well to join this square to the one above it. In this case over here, I have a beige at the top. And I have this square oriented so I can use the off-white here if I want to. Now the off-white square can be oriented in any direction I want. It doesn't follow a geometric pattern like these do. I would probably be best to use the beige because as you can see, this square and this square at the top don't have beige. The only place to use it would be down here. So I'll save this off-white for another position. And if I have all the squares laid out ahead of time, that's part of why I do it, is I figure out where these are best used. It doesn't matter which direction you sew in this case, as the yarn will blend in with the color of the square and it doesn't stand out in the big picture. You are going to have to join strands at some point. So in a different configuration, let's move these squares because we're just using them as an example right now. If it were laying like this, see, I've rotated them. This dark and this beige are not good for this seam. So now I don't have a blue to use on the seam. This is where I'll have to join a piece of yarn. And then over here, again, I can use the off-white because down here I have a blue, not going to work for this seam. So I would use the white. So basically using the ends will depend on how the squares fall when they're arranged in the grid. So just do your best to use the ends you have before you start adding in new ones for seams. Now, let's get to the demonstration of the whip stitch on 2 of these squares. So here I've reoriented the squares again, as I'm just using them as examples, so that I can use this blue and I'm going to demonstrate against this white. So there's a nice contrast. It's a lot easier to see. But if this color didn't match properly to these 2 colors, I would have to join a new piece of yarn. Rule of thumb is 3 times the length of the section you're joining, and then I add a little. So this is a 4-inch square. So you'd want at least a 12-inch piece of yarn to join these. Now, I don't like to have to darn in ends if I don't have to. So if I'm going to join a piece for here, I'm going to make it longer on both ends in case I could use it on one of these seams. So then it would need to be, if I need 12 inches to sew this one, then I want 12 inches for up here and 12 inches for down here, give or take. So I'm looking at about a 36-inch piece of yarn, and that will give me lots on each end to work other seams. Now, if you don't like working with long pieces of yarn, don't do that. It's just an idea because I don't like have to darn in all those ends. If I can use one piece of yarn to sew 3 seams, I'm in. So I'm going to leave these flat on the table while I sew so that you can get an idea of how it's going. I love to do these on my lap usually because it's a very relaxing stitch and it's very repetitive. So you want to take your darning needle and you want to get this piece of yarn onto it. So I just squeeze it and pull it on. And now we're going to work stitch for stitch. So the yarn is joined here. And you can see the chain space is joined at the bottom of the chain space in this orientation. So what I do is go to the other chain space over here, and I come from the bottom up and just gently pull it. You're not going to pull too tight because you don't want to pucker anything, and you can always give it a little bit extra snug later. Now I'm going to go back into the chain space on the right square and do one more loop into the chain space on the left square, pull it up, give it a little snug, and because it's already joined to the square, I don't need to do anything to secure it there. If I was joining the piece of yarn and I had this yarn hanging down here loose, you might find that this keeps gaping open. I go underneath this strand, and I'll do it here. It doesn't matter whether I do it or not for this piece, but I would do that and pull it up. And what it does is it creates a little knot there. Not a knot that stands out, but it creates this knot that secures the yarn. So you don't have to do it if your yarn is already joined to your piece, but it doesn't hurt. Now what we're going to do is go stitch for stitch. Sometimes it's best to look ahead and just make sure we've got everything lined up. I work my way up, and every stitch matches, so this stitch will match this stitch. Yeah, that works for me. Because if the squares are worked opposite, which they probably are, your stitches are going to lie different. So as long as you're consistent and you're just working stitch for stitch until you reach this chain space, it will lie nicely. Take your needle and go back in on the right square into your first stitch, which lies very close to that chain 2 space. Go from the top to the bottom, and then on the white square, which is on the left, go from the bottom to the top, and then pull it through. And that's your first stitch. Not too tight. This is partly why I lie it here, because I want to keep the seam from being puckered. Go back to the right square and go into the next stitch, top to bottom or front to back. Then you want to go into the next square from bottom to top or back to front in the corresponding stitch and pull it through. And now the yarn right here is looping across the top. And this is where you get your whip stitch, because you're whipping the needle around the stitches all the way up. You go into the next stitch, top to bottom, and come back up in the corresponding stitch, bottom to top. Pull your yarn so that it looks just like the one below it, so it's secure but not puckering. And you're going to continue to do that all the way up your square. Make sure you don't miss any stitches along the way, because that will kind of stand out. See how the blue kind of blends into this side of the square? So it's almost an invisible stitch, which is kind of nice. In the grander scheme, won't matter what direction you go. If you look closely, you'll be able to see whether they lie this way or this way. You're not really ever looking that close at a blanket. And because they are the same colors, I even have a hard time when I go back and look at one of my blankets that I know I've worked them in 2 different directions and I can't see it. Now, as we reach the top, I think we'll go 1 more stitch here before we hit the chain space. And now all we have left is the chain space. So go into this chain space, top to bottom, up from the bottom in this chain space, pull the yarn through. You've completed the seam, and now just to secure it, I go back under the loop that we just created right here. You pull the needle through, and it kind of gives it a little bit of a knot as well. And then you'll use the rest of this to sew maybe this seam over here. See, I've got quite a bit left. Or I can just darn it in if I find I don't need it. It's a sunny day today. Can you see the sun shining across my piece here? I normally don't get that. Sunshine is good. Once you've completed assembling the carpenter square design, you're ready for the borders. That will be next week's tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any of my upcoming tutorials. Happy crocheting, and I'll see you next time.